USS Atlanta had a brief but action-packed career in the United States Navy. In less than 11 months of service, she saw action in 2 major carrier battles, supported an invasion, and fought in a chaotic nighttime surface engagement. Battered and burned following the latter action, she succumbed to the depths of Iron Bottom Sound despite the best efforts of her gallant crew to save her. Her keel was laid down on April 22, 1940, by the Federal Shipbuilding and Dry Dock Company in Kearny, New Jersey, and she was launched about a year and a half later in September of 1941. She had an overall length of 541 feet, a beam of 53 feet, and displaced 6,800 tons. Atlanta's main battery consisted of 16 5-inch 38 caliber dual-purpose guns, which were housed in 8 twin mounts. She had 3 superfiring forward mounts and 3 superfiring aft mounts, which were located along her center line. In addition to these, she also had a twin 5-inch mount on each side of her aft deckhouse. This was an unusual main battery configuration for a U.S. light cruiser of the era, but it came as a result of intentions to use her class as scouts and destroyer leaders. With this intended role in mind, Atlanta and her sisters ended up being the only U.S. cruiser class to be equipped with torpedo tubes by the beginning of World War II. She had 8 of them located in 2 quad mounts on each side of her aft deckhouse, just forward of her aft 5-inch mounts. In addition to her 5-inch guns, for air defense, Atlanta was equipped with 16 1.1-inch 75 caliber guns in 4 quadruple mounts and 8 single-mounted 20mm Oerlikon autocannons. Atlanta was lightly armored, with a main belt that was only 3 3/4 of an inch thick at its thickest point, and deck armor that was only 1 1/4 inches thick. This made her a poor choice for surface combat outside of the duties she had been envisioned for, especially when compared to other light cruisers in the U.S. inventory at the time. She was powered by 4 oil-fired boilers and 2 geared turbines which turned her 2 shafts. Rated for 75,000 shaft horsepower, Atlanta was capable of making 32 knots and had a range of 8,500 nautical miles at 15 knots. She was manned by 673 officers and enlisted men. Atlanta was commissioned into the United States Navy on Christmas Eve, 1941, and conducted her shakedown training throughout Chesapeake Bay and then Casco Bay, Maine, until mid-March of 1942. On April 5th, she departed the Brooklyn Navy Yard for the Pacific Theater. She arrived at Pearl Harbor on the 23rd, and after 2 weeks of gunnery practice, she began escorting a convoy to New Caledonia on May 10th. On the 16th, she joined Vice Admiral William F. Halsey's Task Force 16, which was built around the aircraft carriers Enterprise and Hornet, as it steamed back to Pearl Harbor. After a brief stay, Task Force 16 was underway again on the 28th and steaming to the waters northeast of Midway Atoll. During the Battle of Midway between June 4th and 7th, Atlanta operated in Hornet's screen, but saw no action. She remained with Task Force 16 until June 13th, when she was dispatched for upkeep at Pearl. Atlanta spent the next month in Hawaiian waters, including a stint in the dry dock at Pearl Harbor, before getting underway on July 15th with Task Force 16 to support the invasion of Guadalcanal. During the initial landings on August 7th and 8th, Atlanta screened the carriers supporting the invasion until being ordered to withdraw with them on the 9th. For the next 2 weeks, she remained at sea while Task Force 16 operated southeast of Guadalcanal to provide support as needed. As U.S. Marines consolidated their gains on Guadalcanal during the 3rd week of August, the Japanese combined fleet moved south to cover a convoy of reinforcements headed for the island. On the morning of August 23rd, a U.S. reconnaissance plane from Guadalcanal spotted the convoy, and strikes were launched from USS Saratoga and Henderson Field on Guadalcanal. However, the Japanese eluded both of these strikes by reversing their course once the reconnaissance plane departed the area. Throughout the next day, Atlanta screened Enterprise as her pilots searched relentlessly for the Japanese carrier force that was believed to be in the area to cover the convoy. The confirmation of this came just before 1:30 when an enemy snooper was sighted. This also sent Atlanta's men to general quarters, where they remained for the next 5.5 hours. Just before 4:30 that afternoon, a Japanese strike was detected approaching the task force. They swooped in just after 5, and Atlanta's gunnery department got to work defending Enterprise, as the light cruiser stuck with the Big E through every violent turn she took to avoid the dive-bombing attack. Despite the heavy anti-aircraft fire put up by both Atlanta and the battleship North Carolina, Enterprise was struck by 3 bombs and had 4 more near misses. Captain Samuel Jenkins noted in his after-action report that Atlanta may have been responsible for shooting down at least 5 of the attackers. She was detached from Task Force 16 the next day and promptly reported to Task Force 11, where she guarded the carrier Saratoga until August 31st, when the veteran Flat Top was torpedoed by a Japanese submarine. She subsequently screened the stricken carrier as the heavy cruiser Minneapolis rigged a tow line to get her out of harm's way. The force ultimately put into Tongatabu on September 6th, where Atlanta enjoyed a period of upkeep until getting underway on the 13th to escort a convoy to Noumea. Atlanta remained on escort duty until she was assigned to Rear Admiral Willis Lee's Task Force 64 on October 15th. For the next 2 weeks, Atlanta patrolled to the south and east of Guadalcanal with Task Force 64. During the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands on October 26th, her task force operated independently from the carrier task forces and did not see any action resulting from the battle itself. On the morning of October 28th, Rear Admiral Norman Scott shifted his flag from the heavy cruiser San Francisco to Atlanta, and she became the flagship of Task Group 64.2. She got underway that evening and showed up off Lunga Point on the morning of the 30th, where she embarked several Marine officers just before 6 a.m. She then steamed west, and at 6:30 began shelling targets in the vicinity of Point Cruz. After retiring to Espiritu Santo, Atlanta was underway again on November 9th to escort a convoy to Guadalcanal. By the morning of the 11th, she was laying off Lunga Point screening transport ships as they unloaded supplies and disembarked troops. Just after 9 that morning, the task group received a report that Japanese planes were approaching from the northwest. Atlanta and her escorting destroyers formed a circle around the 3 transports they were guarding and led them to the north. The attackers soon emerged from the clouds, and the U.S. formation, led by Atlanta, put up a tremendous anti-aircraft barrage that brought down several planes. The transports soon returned and resumed their unloading activities. About an hour later, Atlanta received word of another incoming Japanese air raid, and she once again led the same 3 transport ships to the north. Although Atlanta and the destroyers opened fire, the planes proved to be out of range. The next day, November 12th, Atlanta continued defending the transports from air attacks as she had done the day before and claimed 2 victories for her troubles. As the sun set that afternoon and evening overtook Savo Sound, Task Force 67 prepared for a night action with a Japanese surface force that had been spotted earlier in the day steaming south through New Georgia Sound. Under the overall command of Rear Admiral Daniel J. Callahan, the U.S. battle line was divided into 3 groups in a line-ahead column. The destroyers Cushing, Laffey, Sterrett, and O'Bannon were leading in the vanguard and were followed by the cruisers Atlanta, San Francisco, Portland, Helena, and Juneau. Destroyers Aaron Ward, Barton, Monson, and Fletcher brought up the rear of the formation. Just before 1:30 a.m., Friday, November 13th, U.S. radars began tracking the Japanese formation off to the northwest at about 27,000 yards. Over the next 20 minutes, the opposing forces closed on each other, and at 1:48, Atlanta found herself suddenly illuminated by Japanese searchlights as she maneuvered to avoid a collision with the destroyers in front of her. Captain Jenkins called for counter-illumination, and his gunnery officer responded with, counter-illumination hell, fire and Atlanta's main battery roared to life. Her first target was the Japanese battleship Hiei, who was a mere 1,600 yards away. After her initial salvo, Atlanta's forward mounts shifted to the lead ship of a destroyer division seen crossing her bow from port to starboard. Identified as an Asashio-class destroyer, this target was hit by half of the 40 shells fired at her. The night's darkness was lit up by a fiery glow as the target broke out into flames, settled and sank within minutes. After this, her aft mounts continued lashing out at Hiei, while her forward mounts dealt with some of the other Japanese destroyers in front of her. It was at this moment that Admiral Callahan realized that Japanese ships were on both sides of his column, and he issued an order over the talk between ships frequency that odd ships needed to fire to starboard and even ships to port. Within a minute of this order being issued, Atlanta's bridge was struck by point-blank 14-inch shell fire. Admiral Scott and all but one of his staff members were killed by these salvos. Captain Jenkins, who had just stepped out onto the bridge wing, was slammed against a watertight door when a shell ravaged the torpedo director. Atlanta took more hits to her superstructure in quick succession, and when the helmsman was cut down at the wheel, steering control was shifted aft. Contact was lost with the engine rooms near this time as well. 12 14-inch shells had turned her superstructure into a roaring inferno. Her forward fire control director was out of commission, but it didn't matter much because all of her forward 5-inch mounts had also been rendered useless after being battered by 6-inch shells from both Japanese battleships. Then, at 1:51, Atlanta was rocked by a torpedo amidships on her port side. She was ripped open and lifted from the water. Cracks opened up down the length of her hull, and her armored deck buckled upward. The bulkhead separating the forward engine room from the forward fire room was cracked as well, and seawater began pouring into her. With a 10-degree list to port, a jammed rudder in the same direction and only auxiliary diesel power, Atlanta began slowing rapidly. And, as if the battering at the hands of the Japanese wasn't enough, within the same minute of the torpedo strike, she was struck by 8-inch shell fire from both San Francisco and Portland. It seemed obvious to the Atlanta's observers that her new attacker must have been using radar, for the shooting was very accurate and no means of illumination was used. San Francisco had fired the first salvo at 1:51, and Portland fired 2 more salvos into Atlanta at 1:52. 7 shells hit her already blazing superstructure. The 5-inch mount right in front of the bridge was hit, and the muzzles of both guns were cut off. Another salvo slammed into Atlanta's aft deckhouse and went right on into her starboard side 5-inch mount. The mount on her port side was hit as well, and its back and roof were blown off with heavy casualties. One of her aft mounts was hit by 3 shells, with 2 penetrating and the third ricocheting off its rear. At 1:53, after the 8-inch fire had ceased, Captain Jenkins took stock of the situation and made his way aft to Battle 2. As the battle continued in its waning stages, Atlanta's men set to work clearing debris, correcting her list, and tending to the many wounded. Atlanta began a slow withdrawal towards the southeast and Lunga Point. 170 of her men had been killed, and another 103 had been wounded. As the new day dawned, Atlanta found herself drifting toward the enemy-held shore east of Cape Esperance. Her anchor was dropped to prevent her from drifting within gun range of the enemy, and Jenkins sent a message to Portland explaining the light cruiser's predicament. In the meantime, small boats from Guadalcanal came out and evacuated her most seriously wounded men. The fleet tug Bobolink arrived around 9:30 and took Atlanta under tow, an operation made more difficult by the fact that the cruiser was dragging her anchor. During the voyage, a Japanese Betty bomber came within range of the group, and one of the 2 surviving aft 5-inch mounts, which was being powered by a diesel generator, fired at it and drove it off. The other mount, under manual control, could not be trained around in time. Atlanta reached Kukum at about 2 p.m., at which point Captain Jenkins conferred with his remaining officers. Jenkins would later write, "It was by now apparent that efforts to save the ship were useless, and that the water was gaining steadily. Even had sufficient salvage facilities been available," he allowed, "the severe damage the ship had suffered in battle would have rendered it doubtful whether or not she could have been saved." Jenkins ordered that Atlanta be abandoned and sunk with a demolition charge. Accordingly, all remaining men except the captain and the demolition party boarded Higgins' boats sent out from Guadalcanal. At about 8:15 p.m. that evening, she slipped beneath the waves about 3 miles off Lunga Point, and her name was stricken from the Naval Vessel Register on January 13, 1943. Atlanta was awarded 5 battle stars and a Presidential Unit Citation for her World War II service. Rear Admiral Norman Scott was posthumously awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor, and a Fletcher-class destroyer was named in his honor. Captain Samuel Jenkins was awarded a Navy Cross for guiding his ship and crew through the horrors of that night in Savo Sound. Thank you for watching, and as always, if you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button, comment, and subscribe. It really helps us out, and we greatly appreciate it. And thank you for all your support over the last year.